Let's open our Bibles to the book of 2 Corinthians, chapter number 12, if you would. 2 Corinthians, chapter number 12. And of course, we're going to be looking at a passage that actually is probably pretty familiar with you if you've been in church for any length of time. And we've preached over the years several messages on this passage. And I would say, you say, well, we heard that message before. Well, I preached it and I don't remember it. So hopefully, I look at sometimes my Bible, this particular Bible I've had for probably 10 years, and I look at the notes that I've got written in these passages on the side, and I say, I don't have a clue what I'm talking about by looking at my notes. And I feel bad sometimes for the folks, but hey, the Bible speaks, not man. God speaks. So we look at 2 Corinthians chapter number 12. And the Apostle Paul, of course, is, I guess you might say, summarizing all that he had been dealing with in his life over the last few weeks. In fact, our last few years, he'd been rejected and despised. He'd been turned on. He literally, you know what, God knows today, I actually picked up the wrong notebook, so I'm going to have to wing it, folks. Can you believe that? Hey, that tells you it's been a rough week. It's been a rough week. I don't see anything in here that I typed out. But, Mike, ask John Mark to get in there. There's a black notebook on my desk. I don't know that I'll need it, but it's certainly good to have a crutch, you know. Let's get back to what was going on here in this passage. Paul was summarizing all that he had been through with this church at Corinth and throughout his ministry. He was some 14 years into his ministry, at least that long, when he penned the words of this particular epistle. And bottom line is, despite the prosperity message that's out there today, this book reveals to us just the opposite about a Bible Christian life. A Bible Christian life was never promised to be without trouble. Quite the contrary, we were warned about the trouble that was coming. The Bible Christian life was not without tribulation. We were warned about the tribulation that was coming. And so Paul pretty much epitomizes the life of every child of God, maybe not in the intensity of the trials and tribulation, but certainly in the pattern that folks deal with on a regular basis. Chapter number 12 and verse number 9, look at verse 7, we'll start there. He says, and lest I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. And for this thing I besought the Lord thrice, and that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Now, his explanation here is actually a defense of his ministry. And what had happened in this particular church, of course, God had led him there, given him the power to preach the gospel. There were a number of folks saved, and out of that, the churches began to develop. The church at Corinth, and they were initially thriving, but as we know, and probably the most plagued church in the New Testament epistles, they began to fall on hard times as a people. Much of it was through their own decisions and wrongful ways, and suddenly you had a church full of dispute, a church full of divisiveness, a church full of, and sadly in some cases, immorality. And so with all of that background and atmosphere, creeped in some false apostles that were people who were claiming to be apostles, but they were not at all. In fact, not only did they claim to be apostles falsely, they began to demean the Apostle Paul. And they said some pretty tough things about him. And they, in one case, they said, you know, we will admit he has great power in his words, but the way he delivers them is weak. In fact, they said he doesn't look good at all. He's small, contemptible. In fact, they were calling him, he's just an ugly guy that can't speak. Can you imagine the great Apostle Paul being deemed that? Now, some of the same group most likely were there at one time when he was preaching the Word of God and doing things in the power of God. They wanted to make him a god. And the fickleness of the human heart, which we all have, turned on him quite literally. And that same bunch eventually decided to kill him. They didn't want any part of him. They wanted to do away with him. They didn't want to hear his words anymore. And in one case, the apostles said they would have got me, except I was let down in a basket by a wall. So he had a miraculous escape from those who were to do him harm. And in all of that, he uses the term in verse number 9 that the Lord had spoken to him, and he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee. You mean in all of my sorrow, in all of my rejection that Paul had felt against him and known to be? In fact, we know the list in his infirmities and his persecutions, his beating, being left for dead outside the city, perils among false brethren, and all of that. What am I to do, Lord? How am I going to deal with this? You've chosen me to be the apostle to the Gentiles. I've been faithful to you and your word, and yet I'm a hated man. I'm despised. I'm rejected. And I live a life, in many cases, on the run. I can't trust anybody. Some of those closest to me have deceived me. What am I to do? And God said, the